The work wife turned out to be much more than just a friend. At first, I didn't think much of it. She was just a colleague, a person I worked with, someone I could rely on when the workload became overwhelming. It was the usual office dynamic. We'd been assigned to the same team early on, and I'd quickly grown used to the way we worked together. Her name was Rachel, and she had a kind of energy that kept the office lighthearted. You know the type, always positive, always willing to lend a hand, always in the right place at the right time. The work wife term wasn't one I had put much thought into when it started, but that's what people began calling us. At first, it was a joke, something that everyone said when they saw how often we were paired for presentations, how our desks were always next to each other, how we seemed to have this effortless rhythm when it came to working together. There were even some inside jokes, things that no one else would understand, just between the two of us. We knew each other's coffee orders by heart, what time we'd go for lunch, and even the small details, like the fact that she always wore mismatched socks or that I took 5-minute breaks just to grab a handful of snacks from the vending machine. It was harmless, at least I thought so. Rachel was friendly, always eager to chat and lend a listening ear. She had a way of making the day feel easier, lighter, something I looked forward to when the pressure of deadlines and late-night work started to build. She knew how to make me laugh when I felt like pulling my hair out. There was something about her presence, something warm and comforting, that made those long hours go by faster. At home, my wife, Emily, never seemed to mind. She'd laugh when I mentioned Rachel's name, teasing me about my work wife, and I'd laugh right along with her, knowing it was just office banter. She would jokingly ask if Rachel had been sitting too close to me at meetings or if we'd been swapping too many coffee breaks. We had our own inside jokes too, small, simple things that made us feel like we were a team, even in the mundane routine of our everyday life. But there was always that small part of me that wondered if Emily ever noticed how much time Rachel and I spent together. After all, we did end up working late often, finishing up projects that had been assigned at the last minute. I couldn't help but wonder if Emily ever questioned why I was always the last one to leave the office or why I'd seem so distracted at home, often replaying conversations or ideas that had come up during the day with Rachel. I tried to reassure myself that it was nothing. After all, work was just work, right? I didn't think it was anything more than a close working relationship. Rachel had become a friend, a valuable one, someone who could push through the tough spots in a project with me, someone I could talk to about things that had nothing to do with work. But there was one moment that changed everything, though I didn't realize it at the time. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, when the office was buzzing with deadlines and the pressure was high. We were working on a presentation for a big client, and Rachel and I were tasked with putting together the final draft. As the afternoon wore on, I noticed something I hadn't before. There was a new energy between us, a slight tension, but one that I couldn't pinpoint. Maybe it was the late hour, or maybe it was the constant back and forth banter that felt a little more charged than usual. I felt more aware of Rachel's presence, more attuned to the way her voice sounded when she explained something or laughed at one of my jokes. I brushed it off, thinking that I was just tired from a late night before. It was no big deal. Rachel, however, seemed to notice the shift too. She caught me looking at her a few times, and I saw a faint smile tug at the corner of her lips. It wasn't a smile like before, nothing friendly or platonic, but something a little different, something I couldn't quite name. My heart skipped, and I felt myself look away quickly, forcing my focus back to the task at hand. "Hey, how's your wife doing? Emily, right?" Rachel asked a casual question, but the way she said it made me wonder if she knew more than just the surface-level details of my personal life. It wasn't an uncommon question, but for some reason, that afternoon, the words hit me differently. "Yeah, she's good. Busy with work as usual," I said, trying to keep my tone light. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Rachel was paying a little too much attention to my answer. And as I answered her, I realized that I didn't know how to talk about my wife without getting this sense of unease in my stomach. It wasn't the usual comfortable chatter. It was different, more probing, more personal, and it felt like I was being caught off guard by something I wasn't ready to confront. The rest of the afternoon dragged on, but now I couldn't stop thinking about the subtle changes in the way Rachel and I were interacting. There was something between us, something I hadn't noticed before, but now couldn't ignore. Later that evening, when I got home, I tried to shake off the feeling. Emily greeted me with a warm smile, as she always did, and we went about our evening as usual, eating dinner, talking about our day. But I couldn't help it. My mind kept drifting back to Rachel, to the way she had looked at me during that meeting, to the way her smile had lingered just a second too long. That night, as I lay in bed beside Emily, I found myself staring at the ceiling, wondering how things had shifted so quickly. How had I gotten so close to Rachel without realizing it? And why was it that I now felt a flutter of unease when I thought about my wife and my work wife side by side in my head? I tried to push the thought away, but it clung to me like a shadow I couldn't outrun. Little did I know, the line between friendship and something more was beginning to blur, and there was no turning back. Over the next few weeks, things between Rachel and me started to feel different. At first, I tried to ignore the subtle shifts in our dynamic. I told myself it was just the stress of work, the pressure of deadlines and client demands. But it was hard to deny the growing tension. There was this unspoken understanding between Rachel and me, something that felt too close to be merely professional. We spent hours together, often alone in the conference room or huddled around a computer screen, reviewing the latest drafts of a project. The more time I spent with her, the more I realized that our conversations weren't just about work anymore. We began to share more personal details, things that weren't appropriate for the office. She'd tell me about her past relationships, the difficult things she'd gone through, and I'd listen, offering advice or a sympathetic ear. In return, I found myself talking about Emily and me, about the struggles we were having, even though I'd never shared such things with anyone before. One afternoon, as we were putting together a presentation for an important client, I noticed Rachel was sitting closer to me than usual. She leaned over to point something out on the screen, her arm brushing against mine. Normally, I would have brushed it off as nothing, but this time I felt a spark, a charge that seemed to linger in the air between us. I looked at her, and she was already looking at me, her eyes a little too focused, a little too intense. "Do you ever feel like we're just pretending, you know?" she asked softly, her voice low, almost intimate. Pretending about what?" I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, though my heart had already started beating faster. "About everything," she said, her gaze never leaving mine. "About how perfect everything looks on the surface, how you've got the perfect wife, the perfect life. But I see you, and I wonder if maybe there's more beneath that." Her words hit me harder than I expected. Was she insinuating something? I wasn't sure, but there was something about the way she spoke that felt loaded, almost like she was testing the waters, seeing if I'd bite. "I don't know what you mean," I replied, trying to deflect the conversation. Rachel gave a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Yeah, I guess you wouldn't. It's just something I've been thinking about lately." I didn't know what to say. There was an uncomfortable silence between us as we both went back to working. But the atmosphere had shifted. It felt like we were playing a game neither of us had signed up for. Rachel wasn't just a colleague anymore. She was someone who made me feel things I shouldn't have been feeling. That night, when I got home to Emily, I tried to shake off the tension I'd felt earlier. Emily was in the middle of cooking dinner, humming along to some song on the radio, and I found myself watching her, wondering if I was imagining all of this. I tried to act normal, tell her about my day, about how busy the office had been, but I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was wrong. Emily and I sat down to eat, and she brought up a topic I had hoped to avoid. "So, how's Rachel doing? You guys are working together a lot lately." I froze, unsure of how to answer. "Yeah, she's fine. Just, busy with everything. We're working on a big presentation for next week." Emily studied me for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. "That's good. You two seem to get along well." "Yeah, we do. She's a good colleague." But even as I said the words, I felt a strange tightness in my chest. Was I lying? Was it really just about work? I wasn't so sure anymore. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, but the unease lingered. I couldn't stop thinking about Rachel and that conversation we had earlier. Was she trying to tell me something? And if she was, why didn't I feel as repulsed as I should have? It wasn't that I wanted anything more with her, but I found myself wondering, if the situation were different, what could happen? As the days went on, the lines between professional and personal continued to blur. We started texting each other outside of office hours. Nothing inappropriate, just quick messages about work updates or an inside joke that had come up during the day. But every now and then, I'd catch myself looking forward to her texts, to the thought of hearing from her. And I hated myself for it. I had a wife, a beautiful, loving wife. Why was I letting myself be drawn into something so dangerous, so risky? The tension between Rachel and me grew more palpable, more undeniable. I'd catch myself zoning out in meetings, thinking about her smile, the way she laughed at my jokes, the way her voice sounded when she asked me to stay late to help her with a project. It was subtle, but it was there. The little moments that felt too charged, too intimate for a work relationship. One night, after a particularly long day at the office, Rachel suggested we grab a drink at a bar nearby. I hesitated. I had plans with Emily, but I didn't want to seem rude or distant. So, I agreed, telling myself it would just be a casual drink to unwind from the day. But as I sat across from Rachel at the bar, the conversation started to shift, becoming more personal, more revealing. Rachel asked about Emily again, but this time, her tone was different. "Do you ever feel like you're just going through the motions with her?" she asked. Her eyes locked onto mine, searching. "Like things aren't as perfect as they seem?" I swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" Rachel leaned in slightly, her voice low. "I don't know. Maybe it's just me, but sometimes I look at you and think there's more to you than just being her husband. You deserve someone who sees you for who you are, not just what you do." Her words stung. They weren't a confession, but they felt like one, like she was giving me a glimpse of something deeper, something she wasn't fully admitting. I could feel the pull again, that subtle, magnetic force that had been building between us. It was dangerous, and yet I didn't want to fight it. I didn't want to feel this way, but I couldn't help it. My heart raced as I realized the direction our relationship was heading, and for the first time, I wasn't sure how to stop it. It was a Thursday afternoon, just a few days after the drink we'd shared, when everything came to a head. The tension between Rachel and me had reached its peak, and I could feel it in every interaction we had, every word exchanged. It wasn't just a playful camaraderie anymore. Something had shifted, something undeniable, and I could no longer pretend it was just innocent banter. We had spent the day preparing for the big presentation for one of our major clients, and by the time the evening rolled around, we were both exhausted. The office was nearly empty, everyone else having gone home to their families, leaving us alone to finish up the last details. As we worked, our conversation had moved from the project to more personal matters again, something that had become all too familiar. "Do you ever think about what you really want outside of work?" Rachel asked, her voice soft, almost intimate. I glanced over at her, surprised by the depth of the question. I had been working on the presentation slides, but now my attention was completely on her. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice sounding more defensive than I intended. It was like I had just realized I was being drawn into something bigger than I was ready for, but I didn't know how to escape it. Rachel didn't seem to notice my discomfort. She pushed on, her eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my heart race. "I mean, do you ever feel like you're not living for yourself? That you're just going through the motions because that's what's expected of you?" I swallowed hard, feeling a tightness in my chest. Rachel had been asking a lot of probing questions like this recently, but this one felt different. It felt more pointed, more personal. I shifted uncomfortably in my chair, unsure of how to respond. "I'm not sure what you mean," I muttered, my voice quieter now. But even as I said it, I could feel the pull between us, the subtle attraction I had tried so hard to ignore. Rachel studied me for a moment, as though weighing my words, before standing up and walking over to the window. The office was dark now, the city lights outside casting a dim glow on her figure. I couldn't help but watch her, her silhouette framed against the glass. It felt like she was waiting for me to say something, and I had this overwhelming urge to follow her, to close the space between us. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, almost like she was letting me in on a secret. I guess what I'm trying to say is you deserve more than this, don't you? More than just being stuck in this life. You're capable of so much more. I stood up slowly, feeling the air between us thicken with every word. I didn't know why, but I felt a sense of urgency. Maybe it was the way she looked at me, or maybe it was the way she made me feel like I was seen in a way that Emily hadn't in a long time. Rachel's words were like a key, unlocking something inside me that I had kept buried. But I was scared. Scared of what this meant. Scared of where it could lead. I'm not sure what you're asking, I said, my voice low. But even as I said it, I knew the truth. I knew exactly what she was asking. Rachel turned to face me, and for a moment, our eyes locked. Her gaze was intense, searching, almost like she was waiting for me to make the first move. I could feel the weight of the moment, and it was like everything else in the world faded away. The office, the presentation, the stress, none of it mattered. All that mattered was the distance between us, the space that seemed to be closing with every passing second. Before I could think, before I could stop myself, I was taking a step toward her. It was like something inside me had been waiting for this moment. My pulse was racing, my thoughts scattered. But all I knew was that I couldn't back away. Rachel didn't hesitate. She closed the distance between us, her hand reaching out to rest lightly on my arm. The contact sent a jolt through me, and for a split second, I couldn't breathe. She didn't pull away, and neither did I. "I just want you to know that I see you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know what it's like to feel like you're just living for other people, but not really living for yourself. And I think you deserve more. You deserve to be happy." I could feel her breath on my skin, her words settling deep inside me. My mind was screaming at me to pull away, to stop, to think about Emily, about everything I had at home. But Rachel was right in front of me, her eyes locked onto mine, and the temptation was too strong. Before I even realized what I was doing, I reached out and cupped her face in my hands. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into my touch, her eyes fluttering closed, as if she had been waiting for this moment too. Then she kissed me. It wasn't a slow, hesitant kiss. It was desperate, urgent, like she had been waiting for this for a long time. My mind screamed in protest, but my body moved on its own, reacting to the pull between us. For a moment, I forgot everything. My wife, my marriage, the life I had built. It was just Rachel and me in that moment, lost in the intensity of what we were doing. But as quickly as it started, it ended. I pulled away, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "What the hell am I doing?" I muttered under my breath, stepping back, my mind reeling with guilt and confusion. Rachel was breathing heavily too, her face flushed. She looked at me, but there was no regret in her eyes. Only something deeper, something that had been building for a long time. "Don't think," she whispered. "Just feel." But I couldn't. I couldn't just feel. I knew this was a mistake. I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. I turned away, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. I couldn't stay here anymore. I needed to leave. But I knew that I couldn't forget this moment. I couldn't forget what had just happened, even if I wanted to. The next few days felt like a blur. I couldn't shake the image of Rachel's face, her lips pressed against mine, the way it had felt in that moment when everything else seemed to disappear. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her again, and I hated myself for it. When I got home after that night, Emily was already in the kitchen, humming as she prepared dinner. The house smelled like pasta and garlic, familiar and comforting. But I couldn't feel comforted. I felt like I was carrying something heavy inside me, a weight I couldn't shake. "Hey," Emily said, glancing up from the stove. "How was work?" I froze, my hand on the doorframe, unsure how to respond. I had no idea how to lie to her, or whether I should. Could I pretend nothing had happened? Could I keep everything as normal as it was before, even though everything inside me had changed? "It was fine," I said, the words coming out too quickly. I immediately regretted them. Emily didn't seem to notice. She smiled and went back to stirring the sauce. "Good. I was thinking we could have a quiet night tonight. Maybe watch that show we started last week? I'm kind of in the mood for something relaxing." I nodded, but I couldn't focus on what she was saying. My mind kept drifting back to Rachel. The way she had looked at me. The way she had kissed me. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Couldn't stop wondering if I had made a terrible mistake. And yet a small part of me didn't regret it. At least not entirely. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. I tried to be present with Emily, but I wasn't really there. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened with Rachel, about how I had crossed a line I never thought I would. And yet, that tiny voice inside me kept whispering that there was more to explore, more to feel. I hated myself for listening to it, but I couldn't silence it. The next morning, I knew I had to face Rachel. I couldn't just avoid her or pretend everything was fine. I had to address what happened, even if it meant confronting my own feelings. When I arrived at the office, Rachel was already there, sitting at her desk with a focused expression on her face. She didn't look at me when I walked in, but I could feel the tension in the air between us. It was thick, palpable. I stood in the doorway for a moment, unsure of how to approach her. But I knew I had to say something. "Rachel," I said, my voice unsteady. "We need to talk." She didn't look up, but I could see her shoulders tense. After a beat, she stood up slowly and walked over to me, her expression unreadable. "What's going on?" she asked quietly, her voice low. She was trying to act calm, but I could hear the anxiety beneath her words. She was just as nervous as I was. "I don't know what we're doing," I admitted, my throat tight. "I don't know how we got here, but last night, it shouldn't have happened. I shouldn't have let it happen." Rachel's eyes darkened, and she took a step closer, her gaze never leaving mine. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't regret it too?" she said, her voice tight with emotion. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to apologize, to take it all back, but the words wouldn't come. All I could do was stand there, helpless, as the reality of the situation began to settle in. But then, in a moment of raw honesty, Rachel sighed, her shoulders sagging. "Look, I know it was a mistake. I'm not going to pretend it wasn't. But I also know something has changed between us. And I don't think we can just go back to how things were before. Not after everything that's happened." Her words hit me harder than I expected. She was right. We couldn't go back. Even if we both wanted to, there was no way we could undo what had been done. "I'm married," I said, finally finding my voice. "I can't just pretend this didn't happen. I have to fix things with Emily. She doesn't deserve this." Rachel nodded slowly, her face a mixture of sadness and understanding. "I get it," she said softly. "I never meant to cause any of this. I was just, I don't know. I saw something in you, and I guess I let myself believe it could be something more. But I don't want to be the reason your life falls apart." I closed my eyes, trying to steady myself. "I don't want that either," I whispered. "But I have to make it right with her." We stood in silence for a long moment, neither of us knowing what to do next. Eventually, I broke the silence. "I'm sorry," I said again, though it felt hollow. I didn't know if it was an apology for what happened between us, or for the mess I had created in my own life. Rachel looked at me one last time, her expression softening. "I'm sorry too. I never meant for things to get this complicated." After a final glance, she turned away and went back to her desk. The moment was over. It felt final. I left the office soon after, my mind a whirlwind of confusion, guilt, and regret. I knew I had to face Emily and confess what had happened, but I wasn't sure how to even begin explaining it. As I walked to my car, I couldn't help but wonder if things would ever truly be the same again. When I got home that night, Emily was sitting on the couch, her legs tucked under her. She looked up at me with a warm smile, but I could see the question in her eyes. She knew something was off. "How was work?" she asked casually, but I could hear the underlying concern in her voice. I sat down beside her, my heart heavy in my chest. I had never felt so lost, so far from the man I used to be. "Emily," I began, my voice shaking. "There's something I need to tell you."